Magic Spoon tastes exactly like your favorite childhood breakfast cereals, but it has no sugar, lots of protein. It's keto and low carb friendly. It's delicious without the guilt. Get $5 off when you click my link below and use the promo code PACMAN. Yesterday morning, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke to not really a joint session, but members of both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, and made a number of requests in that speech, including that the United States put in place and enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which is the enforcement of a no-fly zone is a significant escalation and significant American involvement, and asked for a number of additional weapon systems and additional armaments and supplies. And indeed, later in the day yesterday, President Joe Biden announced an additional $800 million in military assistance to Ukraine, including drones and air defense systems. Now, we're going to go through the politics of it, and we're going to go through the hypocritical reactions to it. But let's first listen to Joe Biden making this announcement yesterday.
It'll include 7,000 small arms, machine guns, shotguns, grenade launchers to equip the Ukrainians, including the brave women and men who are defending their cities as civilians, and they're on the countryside as well. And as well as the ammunition, artillery, and mortar rounds to go with small arms, 20 million rounds in total. 20 million rounds. This will include drones, which demonstrates our commitment to sending our most cutting-edge systems to Ukraine for.
So sending drones is quite a big deal. The breakdown of the $800 million package is 800 Stinger anti-aircraft systems, 2,000 Javelin, 1,000 light anti-armor weapons, and 6,000 AT-4 anti-armor systems, 100 tactical unmanned aerial systems, drones, 100 grenade launchers, 5,000 rifles, 1,000 pistols, machine guns, shotguns, 20 million rounds, 25,000 sets of body armor, and 25,000 helmets. Now, there's a bunch of different things to talk about here. First and foremost, isn't it weird that Joe Biden didn't say, but I need you to do me a favor, though, before sending the stuff? Okay, that's a joke. But in all seriousness, the people on the right, the Trumpists now criticizing Joe Biden for doing this, are the same people cheering and agreeing with Trump that he armed Ukraine when he was president, despite the fact that Trump withheld the aid, trying to strong arm Zelensky into announcing an investigation into Joe Biden, and ultimately was sort of forced, as it were, to release the military aid because of what we learned about him trying to hold hostage the aid over dirt on Joe Biden. So there's like three layers there. First of all, Trump wants credit for arming Ukraine. Okay. But the reality is he withheld that aid and released it because he got caught trying to blackmail them. But then when Joe Biden also sends a bunch more stuff to Ukraine, the very same people who say it was good that Trump armed them don't say that it's good that Biden is arming them. Now, that's the hypocrisy. We've gotten that won't surprise you that there's a bunch of hypocrisy out on the table. In all seriousness, we really are in a proxy war here. Now, it's not a proxy on both sides. Sometimes when people say proxy war, they mean it's a war between A and B being supported by C and D. In this case, it's the United States and other countries sort of fighting a proxy war against Russia, and Russia is in and of itself fighting the war. Now, you don't have to say that just because it's a proxy war, it's good or it's bad. You could argue, well, Ukraine is in the right here, or at least Russia is in the wrong for their invasion, and Ukraine should defend itself. But I don't want my country's troops on the ground. That's the commitment that Joe Biden has made. And so the only way really for a government to support that, there's really two ways for a government to support Ukraine. One, by sending stuff, and two, by trying to sanction Russia or negotiate with Russia to get them to stop. And to some degree, the United States is doing all three of those things, although not necessarily in the proportions that everybody would like to see. The counterpoint would be the U.S. should have no involvement whatsoever. And so, like with many of these things, when it comes to geopolitics, foreign relations, war, etc., there are some in the commentary space who like to use a term and immediately ascribe an implied morality to it. It's a proxy war. Oh, okay. But so is it the right thing or the wrong thing to do? Are we supporting Ukraine in the appropriate ways or in inappropriate ways? And there's really no correct answer. It is without a doubt that Russia as the aggressor should be repelled by any means with which Ukraine can do it. And part of Ukraine having the means to do it is coming from Western nations. Joe Biden said no boots on the ground. He seems committed to it. We've been saying, what about drones? Are drones going over? And indeed, 100 drones are going over. Let me know what you think. And it's very interesting because there are people on the right, it's whacked what's going on. I barely even care what's happening on the right in terms of the discourse because it's so bad faith and sort of worthless, for lack of a better term. Even on the left, there are contingents in my audience who are saying we should do nothing. Okay, if a NATO country is invaded, then we meet our responsibilities as NATO members, but nothing beyond that. That's one side. The other side are people who email me and they say, David, Biden was wrong to say no boots on the ground. This is a war worth fighting, and we should be fighting it with everything we've got, and that includes sending troops. And then it's everything in between in my audience. I would love to hear from you about it. Let's see how to even introduce this next story. It's become a popular talking point now that we are 20-ish days or so into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's become a popular talking point for defenders of the former president, Donald Trump, to say Putin didn't do this under Trump. He's doing this under Joe Biden because Trump was strong and Putin respected Trump, whereas Biden is weak and Vladimir Putin does not respect Joe Biden. And when in the past I've talked about this, I've said to you, that's speculative. That's completely speculative. Trump has never been seen as particularly strong by any world leader. And Russia and Putin preferred Trump over Hillary. So it doesn't really make sense that Russia would prefer the stronger person. They would probably prefer the weaker person. It just sort of makes sense. So it was kind of a speculative claim. And when I came to you and talked to you about it, and I said, sirs and ma'ams, and I said, that's speculative. And if we want to speculate, it's much more plausible to me that the reason Russia didn't invade Ukraine under Trump was because Russia didn't feel the need, because generally they were more pleased with what the international community spotlighted on the United States was doing with regard to Russia at the time. They're both speculative, but one conforms to the facts much more closely. Now, you can even go further in that analysis and say it's not even really true that Russia did nothing to Ukraine when Trump was president, because they maintained their presence in the Donetsk and Luhansk and continued supporting the separatists there. Okay, so it's like not even really true, but among speculation, it made more sense that the reason Putin didn't do more when Trump was president was because he didn't really feel that he needed to, because he was more pleased with Trump as president. Okay, we now have a new perspective, and it comes from Donald Trump's own former national security advisor, John Bolton. And John Bolton says Putin saw Trump doing a lot of his work for him, so he chose not to invade Ukraine. Bolton's opinion matches much of our speculation. Business Insider goes on to say, Trump considered withdrawing the U.S. from NATO while he was president. That's something that is very, Putin likes that. Bolton said it's one of the reasons that Putin did not invade Ukraine during Trump's time in office. And it really makes perfect sense. This was our suspicion, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, I think I would be doing an incomplete discussion of this if I didn't mention John Bolton. Bolton's despicable, of course. And I know that the revolutionary left, anytime you say, hey, the CIA says this or Bolton said that, they say, you corporatist establishment stooge believing what these people say uncritically. No, we're not doing that. It's natural and correct to see John Bolton as a despicable person, one of the great architects of the war in Iraq in 2003. All of it. Of course, of course, of course. And he screwed around during the impeachment. He could have testified, but he opted not to. And he has personal knowledge of how disastrous Trump was. And now all of a sudden, he's sort of like giving us the goods. But at the same time, you can understand that reality about John Bolton and still recognize that what he's saying matches up with much of what was publicly known, and it conforms to common sense as well. Both can be true. And so I am not someone who uncritically accepts anything that horrible neocon Trump, former Trump employees say, but I believe that it's completely plausible what Bolton is saying, and it really makes a lot of sense, and it was our sense from the beginning. Is Bolton a good guy? No. But why would he lie about this specifically? I don't really know. I don't really know. He's certainly a war hawk, opportunist, piece of crap who has repeatedly lobbied the U.S. to go to war with Iran, and he looks out for himself, his financial interests, etc. I just don't think he's lying here. I think what he's saying makes perfect sense. He's been an enabler. He's laid cover for a corrupt war in Iraq and all of these different things. But we suspected that explanation made at least more sense than Don Jr.'s explanation that Daddy's so strong that Vladdy didn't invade. That explanation did not make any sense because Trump was not strong. And in fact, you have to look only at the sanctions. I mean, Hillary Clinton has been sanctioned and banned by Putin and Russia. She's not president, or she's not doing anything right now. And Trump's not on that sanction list. So the evidence all points to what John Bolton happens to be saying. If you disagree with his assessment, by all means, I want to hear from you. And you can find me on Twitter at @dpacman. Let me know your thoughts. It is a brand new year. Maybe you have goals around getting in better shape, maybe cutting back on sugar. That's why you should check out our longtime sponsor, Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon tastes exactly like the delicious sweet breakfast cereals you loved as a kid, but Magic Spoon has 0 grams of sugar, 14 grams of protein, and only 4 net carbs. So it's perfect if you're doing low carb or keto, or if, like me, you just try to limit your sugar intake. You can build your own variety pack with flavors like cocoa, fruity, frosted, peanut butter, cinnamon, cookies and cream, waffle, maple, blueberry. That's my favorite. Magic Spoon lets you enjoy a sweet, delicious snack without the guilt. You can stick to your goals and still treat yourself. And if you don't love Magic Spoon as much as I do, they'll give you all of your money back, no questions asked. Magic Spoon is giving my audience $5 off when you go to magicspoon.com/Pacman and use the promo code Pacman. The David Pacman Show is funded primarily by viewers like you, podcast listeners like you, by our community at the end of the day. And the number one mechanism for that funding is the David Pacman Show membership program, which you can find at joinpacman.com. Not only do you get the daily bonus show, an extra show every day that Alex Jones really doesn't like.
Oh, the bonus show where you want to make money, but everybody else that makes money to fund themselves is bad.
You also get access to the commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show, and they're available 6 hours earlier to our members, roughly 5 hours, 40 minutes earlier. Yeah. Than for everybody else. You can sign up at joinpacman.com. You can use the coupon code WOW22 if you would like a discount. Let's talk about disinformation. The Russian invasion of Ukraine provides an opportunity for some introspection, which we want to do right now. It's very easy and common for us in the United States to hear, oh, the North Korean people are being told this and they believe it. Or the Russian people are being told this and they believe it. Like Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a moral and correct action because it's all neo-Nazis in Ukraine and there's biolabs and they want to be Russian anyway, whatever. And we hear that, and many of us say, these people, how do they fall for this stuff? We're Americans. We don't fall for this sort of stuff. But actually, many Americans fall for exactly this sort of stuff. So the context is, how could they really believe that? Here is Julia Yaffe on MSNBC saying, hey, you know what? It happens in the United States, too. Take a listen to this very, very interesting discussion with Stephanie Ruhle.
Every time I'm asked by Americans, do Russians really believe this stuff? Like, how can they believe this stuff? As if we don't have the same thing happening here. You have, 40% of the population of the American population that was convinced just in 1 year that Donald Trump actually won the 2020 election.
Right.
Russians have been subjected to this kind of disinformation for far, far longer. So it shouldn't be all that surprising. Americans fall for it, too, pretty easily.
True. This is a big topic. When one of the earliest stories I remember where I said, wow, people just believe stuff without evidence all the time, was in the aftermath of the invasion to the Iraq War of 2003. It's ingrained in my mind, like it was just yesterday. I remember covering it in the early days of the show in 2005, 2006. There was a study done by PIPA, which asked Americans basically three fundamental questions. Who did 9/11? Were weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq? And does the world generally approve or disapprove of the American invasion of Iraq? And the study found that Fox News viewers, people who primarily got their information from Fox News, were far more likely to believe, yes, we did find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when we did not. They were far more likely to believe, yes, Saddam was responsible for 9/11. And they were far more likely to believe that the global community approved of the American invasion of Iraq, which it did not. It was factually untrue. And nothing has really changed. In fact, it's kind of gotten worse with social media, echo chambers, and filter bubbles in the last couple of years. Yes, of course, the Trump won thing. So many Republicans falling for it. Trump actually was the winner of the 2020 election. But also beliefs about vaccines, right? Much of the country believes the pandemic is over. And yet 1,000 Americans are dying a day. And we're going to look at some record case numbers later on in the program today. We seem to be heading for another spike. The only question is, how big will it be? It's been how many generations since the Civil War? And we still have, conservatively, some tens of millions of Americans who believe the Civil War was not about preserving slavery. They've fallen for that. And that's hundreds of years ago, and on and on and on. A huge portion of Americans believe demonstrably untrue things. And yet we laugh at Russia that some people have fallen for decades of Kremlin propaganda, or we laugh at North Korea. Now, there's one other layer to this, which is that in many of these countries, let me see how I can say this. In the U.S., there's really no repercussion to admitting you believe a lot of this stuff. Occasionally there will be sort of like social consequences. You'll be laughed at. And if what you say is really, really vile, you might lose your job. But generally speaking, in the U.S., if people believe Trump won the 2020 election, they'll just say it. In countries like Russia and North Korea, to some degree, the people, even if they don't believe this stuff, are more likely to say that they do because the repercussions can be more serious for saying, I don't believe what the government's telling me. So in reality, it may actually be worse in the United States. And what I mean by that is when you ask people in Russia and North Korea and China, whatever else, do you believe this thing? Some of the people who say yes are saying it to stay on the good side of the government, which is not really a factor here in the United States. So as much as we point and say, how do they believe this stuff? It's probably a worse problem here in the United States. This next video is very much worth watching. Republicans seem to be unable to get the hell away from this AFPAC group and conference led by white nationalist Nick Fuentes. And we talked a couple weeks ago, I think it was, about Marjorie Taylor Greene speaking at the AFPAC conference, then being told, you realize it's a white nationalist group, right? She said, I didn't know about that. I was just there because it's young people with energy and enthusiasm. Okay. But it's happening to many Republicans. And there are now calls for resignation for the Idaho Lieutenant Governor McGeachin. This is Janice McGeachin. She also spoke at the AFPAC conference, and this is really, really good. She was interviewed by KTVB's reporter Brian Holmes, and he really did a good job holding her to account. She tries saying, I didn't know anything about the white nationalist stuff. And then he says, well, but so you're saying you didn't even investigate it? She gets into a pickle and she ultimately walks away. This is really good stuff. Let's take a look.
Are you familiar with who puts this event on? Like Nick Fuentes?
I don't know who he is. I've never met him. I don't know who he is.
Did you not look into it before you decided to say, okay? Like to find out, I mean, his name is on it.
Right.
Well, you know what? Nick Fuentes, as I said, I don't know him. I've never met him. I don't know, what he's, everything that he says or does.
Now, every conference that I have spoken at, I don't meet the organizers often, but there's no way in hell that I'm going without doing some serious research into who's putting this on. And I've turned down many conferences, not because I personally met or knew the organizer, but because I knew what the conference stood for. And I didn't think that it was a place that I should be appearing. This gets really good and really tense.
Does not reflect on who I am or who the thousands of others that are participating in this movement.
You didn't bother to look up his name or anything?
I didn't say that.
You did look him up?
You didn't, that's not the question that you asked me.
He just asked it, though.
Did you look up who Nick Fuentes was and what he's talked about? Like things he has said?
I have since.
Since last week, not before?
Yes.
Okay, I guess the question is, because if you've said, well, I'm only
Again,
here
it's
because...
not fair. The mainstream media, you do this to conservatives all the time, but you don't do it to yourself. That anytime there's any kind of affiliation with anybody at any time on any stage, that we're all guilty by association.
Really? I mean, I don't remember people taking this approach when Barack Obama's character was assailed because, 18 years before? He went to, was it Bill Ayers' church? I don't even remember the names of the characters at this point, but I think he was associated with Bill Ayers or some church or pastor something. Nobody was saying, well, come on. And that was 18 years prior. What they're talking about here was 2 weeks ago.
And it's not appropriate.
But the association is not a good one. To be associated with people who are anti-Semitic or...
Stop. Yeah. Excuse me.
Yes.
Hello.
You asked me why I was there, why I wanted to participate and speak.
She's desperate to control. She wants to just keep answering one question and control what it is she's expected to answer. And it's really a very good job that the reporter here is doing. And it's not like Brian Holmes is, he's doing a great job. He's not doing anything particularly unusual. He's just asking very direct questions.
To these young conservatives. That's what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Vincent James was also there, correct? Do you know who Vincent James is?
I've heard of him.
You've had your picture taken with him?
I did have my picture taken with him.
Okay. Do you know what he stands for and things that he has said?
No, I don't know all the things that he or anybody else. And again, I'm just going to keep repeating the same thing, that this guilt by association that the media tries to do with conservatives and conservatives only.
That is a lie.
Is that if we ever have met somebody once or took a picture with them or ever shared a stage with somebody ever, we're all guilty by association.
Now, understand what she did there. It is very different to share a stage in a debate setting where the subject matter is, that's a white nationalist, I disagree with them, and I'm making that clear. than simply accepting a speaking gig at a white nationalist conference. Those are not equivalent in any way. Sharing a stage isn't actually the issue here, but she knows that.
If you want to know why I went there and what my message was, go watch my video.
I did watch your video, and if you
so
had known,
that's what it was all about.
If you had known who Nick Fuentes is, would you have said yes?
Well, again, this movement is so much bigger than one individual. Who cares what Nick Fuentes has to say? Who cares? There's thousands and thousands of young conservatives all across the country that are very concerned about what's happening to our country.
She's really fumbling here, and it's delightful.
We are fighting for the soul of our nation. With these wide open borders, it's only a matter of time that America, we lose who we are as a free country. And I'm not going to run away. I'm not going to hide from being willing and wanting to go talk to young conservatives about these issues.
If you say nobody cares what Nick Fuentes says, but people care that you're associated with them or that you share a stage with someone.
Again, you're trying to do this guilt by association over and over and over again, and it needs to stop. Because if you want to know who I am and why I went there, I told you that. And don't assassinate me or my character over something that any individual that I may ever have met in my life. If there are things that...
And again, that's a red herring too. Just because you once met someone with a vile view is different than accepting a speaking invitation from someone whose movement is what that is.
Are said or that they believe in, then that's that person, it's not me.
But that's not the first time. My point of bringing up Vincent James.
There you go.
Right? I mean, that's not the first time you've been associated with this group.
And she just walks away mid-interview. There we go. She was done with it. So this entire guilt by association thing, number one, if you keep associating with horrible people by choice and then sort of say, well, I didn't know, but then when you're asked, had you known, would you have not gone? Then you say, well, no, she's kind of saying I would have gone anyway because I was speaking to the conservatives there who were concerned or whatever. First of all, they keep associating with absolutely vile people. And secondly, they do the guilt by association thing. They did it to Obama. They do it to anyone who's ever even met a communist or socialist, I think better said, since communists are quite rare in the U.S. And they do it with Black Lives Matter. They find one person and say, this is Black Lives Matter. They do it with Antifa. They do it all the time. Very, very nice job there by Brian Holmes. And we'll have the clips up on our Instagram at David Pakman Show. Don't forget that the best way to support the David Pakman Show is by becoming a member, which gives you access to the daily bonus show, the regular show with no commercials. You also get access to our entire archive of every episode dating back a really long time and plenty of other awesome membership perks. Go to joinpakman.com and use the coupon code BETTER21 for a huge discount. Joinpakman.com. So Donald Trump has essentially ruled out that Mike Pence would be his vice presidential running mate if he were to run for president again in 2024. And this is not particularly surprising given the last 14 months of the things that Donald Trump has said about Mike Pence, but it does make 2024 significantly more interesting. A president running again after losing re-election with a different running mate is interesting. And this we have learned thanks to an interview that Donald Trump gave to the Washington Examiner earlier this week. Washington Examiner writing Trump. Now in this, I know Washington Examiner is not what we typically use as a source, but this is the primary source here. This was an interview that they did. Trump says Pence partnership over as ex-president eyes 2024 comeback bid. Former President Donald Trump is effectively ruling out, tapping former VP Mike Pence as his running mate should he mount a third White House bid in 2024 and win the Republican nomination. Quote, I don't think the people would accept it. Trump told the Washington Examiner Tuesday evening during a telephone interview that he gave from Mar-a-Lago. The former president cited friction stemming from the aftermath of the 2020 election. It's funny to call it friction. You tried to get the guy to do something illegal. Describing that as friction is interesting. Suggesting their differences are too stark to overcome. I would agree with that. Trump claimed the contest was stolen and wanted Pence to overturn the results during the congressional certification of Biden's victory. He can't. Pence, who in his capacity as Senate president was presiding over the certification proceedings, refused, explaining the Constitution granted him no authority. It's interesting to call it a refusal. It's really an inability. He can't do it. He can't do it. Now, as the article says, and as Trump said, Trump continues to insist otherwise. He pointed to bipartisan talks on Capitol Hill to reform the Electoral Count Act, the law governing the congressional certification. We've talked about that already. Trump said, Mike and I had a great relationship, except for the very important factor that took place at the end. We had a very good relationship. I haven't spoken to him in a long time. Now, there's a couple different things that can be talked about here. First, we're upping the uniqueness factor in some sense, because if Trump runs, he would also run. He will have run after losing and pick a different VP. It'll be interesting from like a historical perspective. I also can't avoid saying that the danger factor would likely be greater, because Trump could pick someone that might be more assertive and more dangerous and more useful to him. Trump is reportedly mad at Florida Governor Ron DeSantis right now. But imagine if Trump partnered up with DeSantis, who is much more delusional than Pence in a particular way, and I would argue much more assertive and able to get things done. Pence has conceded that he didn't have the ability to overturn the election, and that was enough to put him on Trump's naughty list. Now, for Mike Pence's part, he was on Maria Bartiromo's Fox Business show not that long ago on March 8th. And she asked him about, what are you thinking for 24? Do you want to see Trump run? And here's how Pence answered it.
Mr. Vice President, before you go, a word on 2024. Do you want President Trump to run? Are you looking to get back into leadership?
You know, all of my focus right now is on 2022. I think we have a historic opportunity to reclaim majorities in the House and the Senate to elect great Republican governors around America. And in 2023, I'm confident the Republican Party will nominate a candidate who will be the next president of the United States of America. And at the right time, my family and I will reflect and consider how we might participate in that process. But
yeah. So not really answering the question. I think of note are how the betting markets are looking at this so far. If you looked at Predict It right now, 39 cents of every dollar are being bet on Trump being the Republican nominee. Very close at this point. 27 cents of every dollar are behind Ron DeSantis being the Republican nominee. And in a pretty distant fourth place are 6 cents on the dollar behind Mike Pence being the eventual Republican nominee. I think there is almost no chance in hell that Mike Pence ends up as the Republican nominee. But needless to say, it'll be an interesting 2024. I want to talk about postmodernism a little bit with you guys. I am going to suggest to you today that the often misunderstood postmodernism that the right assigns to the American left is actually something that we can correctly ascribe to the right. And I'm going to give you some examples here. Now, let's back up a little bit. One of the criticisms that the right loves to make about the left is the left's woke postmodernism means anything goes. Everybody's opinions are equally valid. Everybody deserves an equal seat at any table. We must listen. They say, the left says, we must listen to any harebrained, crazy idea, no matter how unsubstantiated or unbacked up, not backed up it is by empiricism and data or whatever. And that's how the left gets into these crazy things that they end up getting into, like, all the different things they talk about and some of the things we've talked about, right? Like Jewish women aren't intersectional enough to lead the Women's March or whatever the case may be. Now, does that exist on the left to some degree? Well, yeah, it's a very, very small thing on the left. But I would argue that this is a much bigger deal on the right, where when the right says you really can't trust the media. And some guy with a mic on Real America's Voice is at least potentially just as trustworthy as actual investigative journalism that is doing real investigative journalism. Or, for example, scientists, specialists, public health experts, they don't necessarily know what's going on. Some preacher offering you drinkable silver, or some dude on the internet who's vaporizing hydrogen peroxide. All of these things are equally likely to be the proper way to deal with COVID. Or my sister's stepmom's brother's aunt's adopted babysitter is just as good of a resource on vaccines as a doctor. That is actually the place where you see this anything goes as long as it's convenient type of stuff. And look at this example. Here is, now you might have been unaware that the trucker convoy is kind of like still, I guess, going on. And some Republicans have invited the truckers to meet with them. And here is video of a trucker convoy leader saying to Republican Congressman Jim Jordan, listen, the truckers know what's going on with COVID. COVID is over and truckers are the new scientist. And Jim Jordan loves it. This is the very caricature of anything goes postmodernism that they ascribe to the left. Look at this.
So yeah, the country's figured it all out, and I think they appreciate the fact that you're standing up and saying the First Amendment matters.
I mean, the trucker has become the scientist for America now in the world, and there's no science across the world, and these ladies can attest it, that supports any of the mandates or the underlying emergency declarations. There is no data or science. COVID is done, and the American people understand this. Omicron was our off-ramp. Governments need to be bold and grab Omicron and take this exit strategy. Yeah. Sadly enough, it takes the trucker to now stand up as a scientist for the...
Right. The truckers, this country is going down the tubes, but truckers doing the work of scientists are what is going to save us. This is it's a caricature of the very postmodernism that they claim to oppose. There's other examples of this. Bryce Mitchell, the UFC fighter. Last week, I played a clip of Bryce Mitchell saying, I don't know what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and then giving 10 unsubstantiated opinions and conspiracy theories. And Tucker Carlson brings him on as someone to be listened to. Remember this? This is the same thing, guys. Everybody gets an equal seat at the table. UFC fighter, trucker on matters of geopolitics and epidemiology. Why the hell not?
Honored to have Bryce Mitchell join us tonight. Bryce, thanks so much for coming on and for what you said. I haven't seen anybody express it better than you did. Why did you say that?
Well, thank you so much for having me, brother. And I said that because that's the first thing that I thought when he asked me, and I was trying to give him the best answer that I could, and that's just my genuine thoughts on the subject.
How do you get to be so honest when everyone else is afraid to say what they think, and you just kind of say it?
Well, I don't have to be worried about being fired from my job for saying what I want to say. There's a lot of people out there that do agree with me, but they can't say things that I get to say, even though they think them.
Okay,
get fired
anyway, his explanation for how he's coming up with all this stuff doesn't really matter. But again, they say the left has this anything goes sort of idea, but it is they who are actually doing exactly that. And then lastly, Madison Cawthorn. And again, guy knows absolutely nothing about foreign policy or anything. And it has worked on the right. Here is a guy at one of his town halls actually saying, can you explain Russia and Ukraine to me?
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, Congressman.
Yes, sir.
We got this mess in the Eastern Europe there with Ukraine and all that. And I know you've made some reference to President Zelensky being a thug or being, and the government being corrupt. I think we're all trying to figure this thing out. I mean, it seems like we're on the precipice of could be a possible major disaster. Can you clarify some of that for us so we know where we stand with all of that?
I will. So
and again, we already looked at Madison Cawthorn's answer. It's whacked. It's outrageously critical of Zelensky. It attacks Ukraine and does all these different things. Doesn't matter. The specifics don't matter. But the point is, The right loves to ascribe this exact type of, listen, this person's an expert or whatever. Maybe why is a blue-haired feminist explaining gender when that's not really, you need a doctor, I guess, to explain sex and gender or whatever. But then they've got Madison Cawthorn explaining geopolitics. They've got Bryce Mitchell, UFC fighter, explaining foreign relations. And they've got the truckers acting as scientists. It's absurd. And we can't allow them to get away with accusing the left of doing exactly what it is that they do every single day. If you value what we do at the David Pakman Show, remember to support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where you can get access to behind the scenes videos, the daily bonus show, the commercial-free daily show, as well as special discounts on merch, including hats, hoodies, mugs, and t-shirts. You can support the show for as little as $2 a month. Check it out at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Well, my friends, I hate to have to do this to you again. I really do. I wish that things were different than they are. But unfortunately, what we talked about at the start of this week, as far as the virus is concerned, the pandemic, it seems to be coming true. And we're going to go through the data. And again, I want this to be over as much as everyone. And I have, like many of us, started to go back to just a more normal pre-pandemic way of living. And all of it, I'm with everybody on this stuff. But we have to talk about things as they are and not as we wish that they would be. And earlier this week, I told you we're starting to see a little bit of an uptick in some European countries, in some Asian countries. And in all likelihood, at some point, this is going to come here to the United States. And then we're going to have to figure out how bad is this going to get and how deadly is this going to be? And all of the questions we've all been exhaustingly grappling with now for 2 years plus a week. We're basically 2 years plus a week. I guess you'd call it 105 weeks into this pandemic in some way, shape, or form. And there are some very ugly numbers from yesterday. We'll put these up on the screen for people who are watching today. In South Korea, going all the way back to the start of the pandemic, more cases than ever in one day yesterday. Not in 2020, not in 2021. The worst day for new cases in South Korea was yesterday with about 400,000 new cases. That is an ugly chart. Imagine a really steep mountain, so steep that you'd fall off of it if you tried to climb it. That's what the cases look like in South Korea if you're listening today. In Germany, a very big spike to the point where Germany now, on an average, 7-day average, is at the highest point of the pandemic, now averaging about 210,000 cases a day. South Korea and Germany, very different countries, but we are seeing the same thing happen. In Vietnam, just an unbelievable spike, now regularly logging 175,000 new COVID cases per day. Ugly, ugly, ugly. It makes the first year and a half of the pandemic look like there were no cases in Vietnam because of how high the numbers are now. France, although France had a disastrous Omicron wave, so the numbers are nowhere near that yet. But other than the Omicron spike, France is also experiencing average daily cases now higher than the first, second, and third spikes. In the UK, which has been a big leading indicator, I don't know that there's any country that has better predicted what happens in the US than the UK throughout the pandemic. The UK's daily case numbers are now back up to about 60, 70,000 cases per day. And there's a question as to whether that's as high as it's going to go or whether it's going to continue climbing. Italy, which, remember, at the very beginning, Italy had one of the worst spikes. That spike, when we now look back, looks like nothing. It looks almost completely flat in April of 2020. And that was outdone in November of 2020. And of course, overwhelmingly outdone by the Omicron spike. Italy is now higher than at any point other than the Omicron spike. These are really, really ugly numbers. Now, let's kind of talk through What's the most disastrous interpretation? Well, some of that we're seeing in a number of different articles. One such article in Stat News: with infections spiking in Europe and a variant on the rise, experts warn the U.S. could face a COVID resurgence. And of course, we don't know how bad it could get. We're still seeing 1,000 people a day die. So could that get back up to 2,000, 3,000? It's a question mark. And obviously the hope is no. The hope would be no. Now, some of you might be saying, wait, I haven't heard of a new variant. This is kind of a subvariant of Omicron. Omicron was called the BA1 variant. We're now seeing BA2. It's not its own unique variant in a sense. It's part of the same Omicron lineage. And it, from what we know right now, and I always want to be careful, from what we know as of right now, it is equivalent to Omicron in terms of severity, but it seems to be more contagious. So it's not its own variant, but it is a version of Omicron. So that's a pessimistic or more alarmist reaction. NBC News reporting on what the WHO now says. WHO says global rise in COVID cases is only the tip of the iceberg. After more than a month of decline, global COVID cases rose last week, with the biggest jump in the Western Pacific region, which includes South Korea and China. And of course, the question is, if and when this is coming to the United States. Now, I will now give you the more optimistic interpretation, which is the one I'm hoping for. And that would be, we've seen some other countries get through the BA2 variant already. They had their Omicron spike, and they had their, it's sometimes called stealth Omicron or BA2 spike. And it was a spike, but it was relatively short, and it again declined quickly. That would be the hope for the United States. The reason we might be less optimistic in the United States is we only have, I don't remember now if it's 26 or 28% of the population who has had 3 doses. And as we learned during the Omicron spike, that third dose, very, very effective at mitigating the impact of Omicron. We've learned that the 2 doses are not great when it comes to Omicron. We've also learned that a 4th dose, based on the data from the first Omicron spike, the 4th dose didn't really seem to do much to help with Omicron. So 3, it's this bowl of porridge is too cold, this bowl of porridge is too hot, whatever. So the hope would be that as more people get that 3rd dose, that we would end up with a BA2 spike that is not that bad. Analysis from the UK Health Security Agency shows the BA2 subvariant of Omicron is about 80% more contagious than BA1, and BA1 is the original Omicron variant. Cases and hospitalizations are rising in the UK and in a number of other countries. So we've said before, we might get to a point where cases don't really matter if hospitalizations don't go up as well. Unfortunately, in some of these European countries, we're seeing not only cases rise, but also hospitalizations. So we will continue following it and obviously hoping for the best. This is super interesting. Yesterday, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, spoke to the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, and as I said earlier, made a number of requests for equipment. And we've already talked about how Joe Biden is sending some additional equipment to Ukraine, but at least for the time being, not getting involved in creating or enforcing a no-fly zone. And one of the fascinating things to see has been the right-wing media tear itself apart about how they're supposed to react to this. And it's there's sort of 2 sides to this. And both want to criticize Joe Biden. Just understand that they all want to slam Biden, but they're at odds as to why. It's sort of like the flat earthers, where we've said before, all of the flat earthers agree the earth is flat. But often the defenses they give conflict with each other. So one story that some in the right-wing media are telling is Biden's bad because he's not giving Zelensky what he wants. Zelensky's asking for all this stuff. We should be sending it to Zelensky. Biden's not giving Zelensky everything he wants. So Biden is a disaster for that reason. OK, another story from other members in the right wing media is Russia and Putin really aren't that bad. Ukraine's bad. And we really shouldn't be helping them very much. So Biden's bad because he has sent military assistance to Ukraine. That's a conflict, right? They both say Biden's bad. One says Biden's bad for not giving Ukraine enough stuff. The other says Biden's bad for giving stuff to Ukraine. And it was made front and center last night on Fox News. Sean Hannity invoked Ronald Reagan in his monologue to support sending more to Ukraine than what Biden has sent. Laura Ingraham invoked Reagan in her monologue to say we should not be sending stuff to Ukraine. It's fascinating. Look at this. Take a look at this clip from last night.
Bad actors. We should learn the lessons from Reagan. Give Zelensky what he's asking for, the weapons that they need so they can battle back against Russia, the Ukrainian people.
Reagan won the Cold War by rebuilding our economy and growing our military, which took a few years after the devastation we faced under Carter. The same pattern will have to play out here. Now, as the Angle has said from the beginning, the situation in Ukraine is a horrific tragedy. It breaks all of our hearts. But we have to be prudent and we have to be thoughtful in our response. And right now, the U.S. is simply in no good position to engage in another protracted military struggle. We need time to repair our economy, reform our military, and get political leadership that actually works, is good, is smart. Whatever happens, we cannot repeat the same mistakes we made after 9/11.
So that's just fascinating. Hannity says the lesson from Reagan is we've got to arm them. And Laura Ingraham says the lesson from Reagan is we shouldn't arm them. And of course, it all is in service of their overarching narrative, which is Biden's bad. They agree Biden's bad, but for different reasons. And Laura Ingraham spent most of last night pushing back on sending equipment to Ukraine. And of course, it's a legitimate position to take that we shouldn't send stuff to Ukraine. Reasonable people can disagree about that. Perfectly fine conversation to have. For them, it's all in service to attacking Biden. Here's Laura Ingraham pushing back on the fighter jets debate to attack Joe Biden.
To be where President Zelensky urged him to be today, which is leading the world in helping Ukraine fight for their own freedom.
Well, Biden can't lead the United States, Senator Cotton, with all due respect. I mean, when I hear President Biden being told you need to lead the world, first of all, with all due respect to President Zelensky is obviously incredibly heroic. He's fighting for his country as he should. But we have a president who's, as I said in the Angle, essentially a hologram. He is not an active president defending our interests here, let alone the president of the world. So, I mean, I think going down that road is kind of ridiculous at this point.
So there's Laura Ingraham and one more Laura Ingraham clip here. She says, isn't all of this that we're sending to Ukraine just going to give them false hope and they're just going to lose anyway?
In many cases. I mean, just look today, they announced the transfer of $800 million of weapons to Ukraine. That's welcome. Should have been done a month ago or 2 months ago, and it's still just a fraction of what Congress proposed last week. Look, the Ukrainian people and army have proven that they are capable of fighting the Russians. We need to encourage them to do so, and we need to provide them the weapons that they need to fight the Russians.
Now, you don't think we're giving the Ukrainians at this point and the rest of the world false hope? You think given the fact that Russia is closing in on Ukraine at this moment? You heard the air raid sirens outside of Lviv.
Okay, so you get it. Aren't we just giving them false hope by giving them stuff? And then lastly, here's Laura Ingraham reacting to Mitt Romney saying, send them what they are asking for.
People are dying. Send them the planes that they need. They want MiGs. Get them the MiGs.
Why don't you pay for them? Now, did he ever stop to think that more people could die if we send Ukraine MiGs?
So it's actually going to be worse if we send stuff. Now, again, there is a legitimate conversation about to what degree should the United States be involved here, either individually or as part of NATO. That is a fair debate. But it is fascinating to see number one objective is Biden bad. That's the primary goal here. Some right wingers justifying it in one way, other right-wingers justifying it in a way that directly conflicts. But Biden definitely is bad. That they're very sure of. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a really funny voicemail. I have a new nickname. My new nickname is Book Boy. And I have to tell you, it's not really an insult. I wish more people read books. I kind of like this. Take a listen.
Hey, Book Boy, what's going down? Have you figured out street smarts yet?
Right.
What the government's doing? I have a question for you.
Please.
What is your interpretation or your understanding of democracy? Because I'm getting different answers from everybody.
I mean, in a super simple way, I would say democracy is when the will of the people is able to be expressed and is acted on by our representatives. I mean, a lot of these right wingers love to have us define terms. Like when I was on with Jesse Lee Peterson, he said, "What is love? What is a man?" And I told him, I don't know. I don't really do dictionary definitions, but I guess in some way it's a system in which the desires of the people are freely expressed and then acted on by our elected officials. I don't know. It's very, maybe that's quaint.
Do you understand what democracy is and what the is supposed to be going on with that? I don't think so. I don't think so. The government does not run this country. Big business does.
Okay.
That's why they legalize lobbyists. And
I mean, listen, he's not wrong about the outsized influence of big business, for sure.
you can pay for any congressman or any senator they want to. Do you honestly think that we're being served as a country through this government? And if you do, then you're naive.
So here's the thing. This guy's making it about this particular government. The systemic problems with American government haven't changed because Biden won and Trump lost. And I'm right there with him. But the idea that there's something particularly pernicious about the Biden administration, no, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about a court ordering actor Jussie Smollett released from jail during his appeal. We will talk about the new $125 million demand from former CNN host Chris Cuomo. He says he was wrongfully terminated. We will talk about that. And lastly, Netflix is testing a new feature to fight against password sharing. Yeah. We will talk about all of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Sign up at joinpacman.com. I'll see you then. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Magic Spoon tastes exactly like your favorite childhood breakfast cereals, but it has no sugar, lots of protein. It's keto and low carb friendly. It's delicious without the guilt. Get $5 off when you click my link below and use the promo code PACMAN.